My name is Chris Johnson, from LaSalle originally, and now I'm just here with my brother Sheldon to just do this interview and do a testimony, give my testimony, and let it reach whoever it's gonna reach. Well, first off, I moved to LaSalle when I was 5 years old. We moved to 31st Avenue, that's around Riverside, and then when I was 7 years old, we moved to 585 Barons, where I spent the majority of my childhood, teenagehood, early adulthood. In the early mid 80s, I'll say it was, I want to say, a quiet place for the most part. But I think coming into the late 80s, you started to see a lot of activity on the street. I was young. In retrospect, I can look back and I know what it was now, but at the time I didn't know what was going on. But like I said, when you look back, you knew it was like a lot of drug dealing, quite a bit of violence. For the most part, that's what was happening around me. My siblings, they're younger than me, so I didn't really have older sibling that I was running around with. Both my parents lived with me. My dad left home when I was 8. He left the city when I was 13, 14. So I want to say it was fun up until that point because I was really close with my dad. And when he left, it was like a blow. I probably tried to play it off back then, but you don't really notice those things until later on. The effect that it had. So yeah, I called myself a regular kid running around. I wasn't really a troublemaker, but as a kid, trouble seems to sort of find you. I was going to church the whole time, but I think most of my generation knows how that is. We go to church, but we don't really want to be there. And our school friends are like more important than our church friends, so we tend to gravitate to them more. And so as a result, we tend to do the things that they're doing. And like I said, because my dad left, my mom being a single mom, I think my mom did the best job that she could possibly do due to the circumstance. And but the streets have a stronger pull than any one parent could have, and so I would say I was like a victim of the environment I was in. I think my grandmother played a major part in my faith shaping, if we could call it that. And so while I was running around doing whatever I was doing, my grandmother's voice was the voice that was like, I will say the Holy Spirit was using my grandmother and Uncle Junior, which I'm sure a lot of us who would be listening to this know. Those are my two spiritual voices that I would say had a major influence. Fast forward to my adulthood, I think that's when I was able to look back and to be able to appreciate the first off what my mother was doing. Growing up in a single parent home, I think in our time was frowned upon, but then you realize so many of us were growing up in the same conditions, so it wasn't as embarrassing, because I didn't have my dad living at home, but neither did my friends. When I got baptized, I started to understand more what was happening in childhood. And so I think that's probably the only aspect I was able to use to help my faith grow, because I understood where God's hands were back then, where when I was living in the moment, I couldn't see God. I couldn't really understand where he was, and I just looked at church as just a thing that we did because we were sort of born into it, so I didn't really have an understanding. But when I looked back, I was able to see where God was maneuvering my family and taking us through those tough times that we went through, because we went through a lot of tough times, a lot of tough times. We probably didn't recognize it back then, but think I don't know, I can't remember where I heard it, but they say when you grow up in the ghetto, you don't really understand you're in the ghetto. It's when you visit, wealthy places or even middle class places where you realize like where I am is not ideal. So yeah, I think all in my upbringing, as far as single parent and my siblings go, is when I was grown and able to look back and see how God was like carrying us through, and I had like a better understanding of how God works. We listen to Bible stories and we hear the stories on how God um, carries certain individuals through, but it's when you look at your own life and see him, how he works in your own life, where you get like a better understanding of how God works. And I think that ultimately was how I was able to grow. Any kind of spiritual growth was in my retrospect, looking back. I was able to tell how God really works, how he works in our time. It was in my early adulthood when I got baptized. So I would say um, just understanding, you know, um, I think when we come upon tough times, we have this, we're prone to ask, why is this happening to me? And we don't understand why it's happening. I think for myself, my faith gave me the advantage in the sense that I understood why things happen. I probably didn't understand the intensity. The intensity was probably what threw me off, because there's many tough times, there's medium tough times, and then there's like confusing, like it's so bad it's confusing you. I think for the small and the medium, I was able to understand what God was doing, and because I was able to understand what He was doing, it sort of helped me through the situations. Because I think most of my trials came later on in life, and at that point, my spirituality, I won't say was at like peak level, but not really get phased by it. Because when you have an understanding of how God works, and especially when you get it at a younger age, when the things come to you at an older age, you already know what's happening. So really all you start doing is questioning, like, how long is it gonna last? Because you know it's gonna end, but you try to build your patience up, and I think that's probably ultimately what carried me through, is the patience that God built me up. He put me through little things, and built me up to the point where when the big things came, I was able to go through it. Not to say I flew through it. Again, a lot of it was still patience developing, but I mean, for the most part, I think I got through a lot of those things. I don't have regrets. I don't hold malice of decisions that I made in the past. I always looked at those things as learning lessons. So I think once you have that mentality, you don't really look at trials the way most people do. You have a better understanding, and so it's easier to get through it. It's easier to navigate through it. And of course, Bible. I think my Bible studying over the years has increased, and I would say in stages, but the one that took me up, like, we have, I'll use school as an example. You go from grade 1 to grade 2 to grade 3, and I think for the earlier part of my spiritual life, it was going at that path. But I think when I started to read Sister White, that's when I made a jump from like grade 6 to like grade 10, because the explanations that she gives us is beyond anything of our time. Um, I know she's not she's not celebrated as much. Not that she's the one who's celebrated, but I'm talking like the writings that she was inspired. It's not so much celebrated as it once was. But if I could give any advice, I would say we need to go back to her writings, because she has she was given a lot of explanations of the things that we're going through today. And, so sometimes when we ask God, like, what do we do? Or what's going on? Sometimes we think he's not answering, but the thing is, he already answered. We just gotta go back and look at the answer, and I think she has a lot of the answers of the things that we're seeing today. First, I would try to relate the young individual, if anything that they're going through was anything that I personally went through, because I think that's like the best connection you could make with somebody, is if you sort of suffered the same things that they suffered. So I would first try to find out if what they're going through is anything like I went through, and I would probably advise them from that perspective, and pray. I would definitely tell them pray. It's in those times where, because a lot of times when those things happen, it's just God trying to get your attention. Not that he's sending those things to you, but he may allow those things to happen to you so that you turn to him. And I think that would be the best advice I could give them, because it's really not about me, And I know there's certain, God has given us certain people that we have influence over, and so there's a reason why certain individuals might come to me. And as a result, I would try to do my best to give them what I think is the best advice, but really and truly it's not really about me, it's about that individual and God, and I would just try to let God use me as an instrument. And so I would I'll definitely pray about what it is I tell them, because I think too many times we just fling out our advice and it's just repeated words, I mean, you could YouTube general advice and hear it from anybody. So sometimes it's not so much advice, it's a mentality that you want the person to have. I always say situations isn't the problem, it's the mentality that you have. And once you could develop the right mentality, then when the situation comes, you'll be able to maneuver through the situation. It's not going to be a big deal. You'll know what to do when the problem comes. And I think that would be my best advice. I wouldn't focus on the situation that the person is going through. I would more look at the mentality that they have, and to see if it's a defeated mentality or I want to get through it mentality. Those are the two mentalities that you could have, and that would make the difference, as whether you get through it or not. You get through situations all the time, but how you handle them and whether it breaks you is going to be the mentality that determines that. So I would definitely try to address the mentality that they have, and just point them to God, man. That's what we're commanded to do. Not so much give Chris's advice, but what would God do in this situation, and just try to regurgitate the same thing. I try not to focus on methods either. One thing I will say, as us growing up as West Indians, one thing we could say, if we're honest anyway, is we're not soft. We grew up with parents who were pretty much rough around the edges, and so we can't have the excuse of, well, what they're saying may be right, but the way they're saying it turns me off, so I don't want to hear it. If you look at John the Baptist, when he was dealing with, I think it was Herod, and he was telling him about the wife that he had, there was no method. He didn't apply any, soft method in his addressing the situation. He just said what he had to say. I think when Jesus was dealing with the thieves, in the church, when they were buying and selling, he didn't apply any soft method to what he was saying. He addressed it. Now, whether they learned the lesson or not, the Bible doesn't mention that, but I would say this: if I was one of those buying and selling, turning the house of God into a den of thieves, I would have got the message, But the only reason I would have got the message is because I don't really nitpick on the methods that's applied. And I think once you don't nitpick on the, the, the methods, then you'll focus more on the message that's coming to you. And I think when that happens, you open up a way to God for God to talk to you any way He needs to. We could use parents as an example. When you're a parent, there are certain times when you talk to your son or your daughter in nice, you put the cup down, in a nice voice. But there's some times where you got to be like, yo, put the cup down, man, and you don't play around you don't mince your words. If the child is obedient, they're gonna listen. Whether you apply the soft method or the harsh method, if the child is obedient, they're gonna learn the lesson, and they're gonna benefit from it. And so when I look at little examples like that in society, and just in my own life growing up, I feel like those are the ways that I could let God talk to me on a broader scale. It will be much easier for me to hear Him talking to me when I don't limit the methods that He uses to talk to me. Pastor Martin, he was a pastor at our church many years ago, and he visited LaSalle Church, and I don't remember, I think it was at AY, and he just posed a simple question. I don't remember what the question was, but it pertained to the relationship that I had with my mother. And in that 90s that I talked about, me and my mom, we were at war with each other. Like, we really, really, really didn't get along. And but it was repaired, and the way it was repaired was through a prayer. I heard her praying for me, and it changed everything. Because up until that point, I was convinced that my mother hated me, and for a long period of time, I carried that in my heart. So of course, if you think your mother hates your guts, then you're gonna behave accordingly. I'll just to put it in short. But it was up until a certain day, certain morning, early morning, when I had heard my mother crying, and I remember I put my ear to the door to hear what she was crying about. But I found out, after listening for a couple of seconds, I realized she was praying. So when I listened, a little bit longer, I realized it was me she was praying for. And so it changed everything. And outside of Uncle Junior and a few close family members, nobody really knew that we were at war like that. But of course, into your adulthood, you tell people, and I didn't like my mom, and we didn't get along, and so I just felt like because there was that stigma of me not getting along with my mom, I felt like the opportunity to, because I also know that there's other people that sort of go through the same thing, where they grew up and they don't get along with their mom, and some of them never repair it. So it was at that AY where I felt like now's a good time to give the testimony, because if I tell that testimony, it will let people outside, like the listener, know that you might not have got along with a parent or anybody for a long period of time, and but if you're faithful, God will repair it, and there's no greater testimony, especially growing up in a single parent home, because I know that it wasn't easy for the parents either. And I think when a testimony like that goes out, it will make the parents look back and maybe have a better understanding of what their child was going through, or why they were behaving the way they were behaving, and vice versa. The kid, or say the adult, like that's in my generation, the testimony may make them go back and understand a little bit better. Maybe your mom didn't hate your guts like you thought she did, you know, and maybe and again, maybe the parent will look back and say, maybe my son or daughter didn't hate me like I thought they did. The older generation connecting with the younger generation. I think I feel like I only learned that like a couple years ago, because I felt like every generation is further, like they need to learn to deal with their own generation by themselves, and they figure it out. And if they don't figure it out, then they don't figure it out. If they do, they do. But I learned that it's the connection with the older generation that will walk you through the generation that you're going through, because although they may have gone through things a little bit different, I think the principles are the same. And so if you have somebody older than you walking you, guiding you through, it will make your life that you're living a little bit easier. I'm not saying they will breeze you through everything that you go through, but you'll have a better understanding. And I think if I learned that lesson, I want to say in like my teenager years, then my early adulthood wouldn't have been so rough, you know, because I think a lot of the mistakes I made was, I put it this way, if I made 100 mistakes, if I connected with the older generation, I would have made 50 mistakes, something like that. You know, I'm just using numbers to make my point. But I think if I had learned that lesson earlier, my early adulthood would have been much easier. And another lesson I want to sort of point the listener to is the writings of Sister White. I heard the importance, because being a Seventh-day Adventist, I think the writings that God gave her plays an integral part in our movement. And if I had knew that back then, who knows? I might be a super Adventist now. You know, I might have been a preacher or something. Who knows, man? Because the wisdom that she gives in her writings is just, it's out of this world. But one of the things she talks about is Christian education, and just us being educated the way we ought to be, I'll say. And of course, as we know, we have an Adventist church in the city, and in my early, I think it was grade 7, I was, my mom put me in that school, and I rebelled, you know, I rebelled so much so that I forced my way out of there. And if I had knew how important that was to get a Christian education, and the reason why I'm tying the two together is because it's in her writings where she encourages the Adventists to be educated in a Christian environment. I think if I had understood that back then, it would have made, I'd be a totally different person, because not to say that the school was way better, or because a matter of fact it wasn't, it was accused of not being up to standards, I'll say, but the environment would have been different. And it was from that school when I went over to LaSalle High, where I spent the formidable years of my teenage years, and I believe those are the years that make you into the adult that you're gonna be. Because I did that, because I made that decision and just went against my mom's attempt to put me in the right environment, I think the way I was formed as a teen was very bad. I made a lot of bad decisions, and I think if I had took the Christian education route, or fell in line with it, I'll say, I wouldn't have made half the mistakes that I've made because I wouldn't have been in the environment to make them. There was a certain point where I realized, not even that I realized, I told God, however you want to use me, use me. I won't resist. You know, I think at that point I was at a level of studying where I understood we are to be instruments in God's hands. And so if I just make myself available, then he will put me in the right, because I think at first I was scared to be used, because we see people, I'm not a speaker, I'm not a public speaker. I don't think I talk a lot. I mean, outside of basketball, I'm not really comfortable like that, so to speak. And but every time we look at through the lessons of the Bible, we understand that God used people like that, people who didn't want to talk. If we go through, I think Exodus chapter 4, that's when God called Moses. He mentioned, he said that, I can't speak. And he reassures him by saying, aren't I the one that created the body parts, And the Bible says he touched his mouth and he put his words in him. And so even in my shyness, I understand, God could still use me. And so once I made up my mind to be used, what I did say, because obviously when I made up my mind to be used, it's not like he used me right away. So what I said to him was, use me how you want, and in the meantime, I'll just study the Bible. And when he's ready, he will use me at the right time. And so I think after a couple years of studying, a couple years of growth, the eldership just sort of came. I didn't overcome anything in particular. I knew my mindset was, God, use me how you want to use me. And I think when I said that, it was maybe 10 years before I became an elder, So even before then, he would use me in smaller things like Sabbath school teaching, maybe an intercessory prayer during service or something like that. Some smaller thing where I could look back now and say he was just building me up. And when the eldership nomination came, I said, use me. It's just me trying to hold up my end, of not that we bargain with God or anything like that, but I just want to stay true to my words. There's nothing that we can do to impress God, so I don't do it for heaven points or something like that. I try to do it from just a pure heart. God loved, the Bible says we love him because he first loved us, so if God showed love to me, then the best I could do is show love to him by obeying him. Try to disconnect. Try to unplug yourself from this quote-unquote matrix that we live in, because the attacks are coming from so many different directions. And if you don't see where the attacks are coming from, you're gonna get hit. It's like a blindfolded boxer. You can't blindfold a boxer and say go in the ring and fight, and the enemy, the opponent doesn't have a blindfold on. You're gonna get wailed on, because you can't see what you're trying to hit, and nor could you see where the hits are coming from. So I would probably try to draw an analogy like that to explain to them how important it is to disconnect from the society that you live in. You gotta live in it. You gotta be a part of it. You gotta function in it, is what I'm trying to say. But you don't have to be a part of it. Programming is a hard thing to get rid of. It's a hard thing to reverse. But it can be reversed. It's only through the Holy Spirit. We're seeing a shift in today's society. What we used to call wrong is now being called right, or it's being said what's wrong with it. And we hear language like, well, it's all relative, so your rights are your rights, but my rights are my own. And that's a recipe for disaster. It's just a matter of time how long you'll be able to get away with that type of thinking. So I would just try to point everybody back to God, man. That's the only way. To me, that's the only way to get back on track. That's the only way to survive. And if you want to get a better understanding of what we're seeing today, I would endorse the book Great Controversy. I think ultimately that's a book that it's a history book for us, but it's also a book that tells what's going to happen. But not only that, it tells us how to get through it, And I think once you put your trust in God like that as crazy as things may be happening, you won't be worried. I think really my only worry that I would say I have is for the ones who don't know. If you know, that's the advantage of prophecy. It's to be able to be prepared for what's to come. But if you don't know, then how would you be prepared? And it's like getting hit with a tornado, but not knowing the tornado was going to come. That you didn't get a chance to board up your walls or buy sandbags or whatever it is people do when tornadoes is about to hit. So we have the advantage of being prepared for the tornado. Let's take advantage, and just help others who aren't prepared, because that's what we're here to do. We're actually here to prepare them for the tornado that's to come. Take yourself out of the herd, take yourself out of the wave of ideologies that we see, because it's going to lead us down a path of destruction. And unless you pull yourself out of it, you're gonna have to suffer the consequences with the rest of them. And I wouldn't want any one of my loved ones to suffer that. Even ones I don't know, I don't want them to suffer that. So that would be my message. Just try to pull yourself out of the herd and reconnect with your Lord and Savior.